Rabbi Yaakov Menkin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Great to be back with you. Thank you.
Well, talk to me about Israel's parliament just overturning this new law about unreasonableness in the judicial system. Can you explain this?
What's happened is the Knesset finally passed a measure. There's been grumbling about the Supreme Court being out of control literally for decades in Israel. Unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, where the president nominates a candidate for the Supreme Court and the Senate then has to confirm that candidate, what happens in Israel is there is a selection committee. Two members of the selection committee are members of the Supreme Court. Two other members are members of the Bar Association, which means, of course, they are beholden to that court in which they will argue as the court of final appeal. And only two members of the selection committee are Knesset members. So basically what you had in Israel was a self-selecting Supreme Court, totally undemocratic, and taking upon itself, arrogating for itself, the right to overturn Knesset decisions. What they are now overturning in the Knesset is a right that the Supreme Court arrogated for itself to overturn a Knesset decision simply on the grounds that it was, quote unquote, unreasonable. Now, it turns out that one of the leftists who was very against this measure did a study of courts around the world, and that immediately got hushed up. It got dropped from the media because the result was that there isn't a court in the world that is able to overturn government decisions simply because the court decides those decisions are not reasonable. That's not how it works.
And how did they deem that it's unreasonable or not?
They just had to make up their minds it was unreasonable. It had nothing to do with any law. The most recent example of this is Aryeh Deri, representing the Sephardic Torah party. His party got over 300,000 votes, which means to say over 8% of the vote in a country of 4 million people. They had the second or third largest representation. I think it's the second in this current Knesset, which means to say that they were a very popular party. And so, of course, he was going to become deputy prime minister as a result of coalition negotiations. Well, the court said that because 2 decades ago he was convicted in which crimes, by the way, the right wing said immediately, this was all politically motivated persecution, which, of course, in America we are sadly all too familiar with. But because of that ridiculous persecution of Deri from 20 years ago, and actually more recently in 2022, something about his taxes, they went after him again. Well, they said it's not reasonable to have him as a minister. Number one, 300,000 voters felt otherwise. And number two, there's absolutely no law that says otherwise. Oh, to which number three, it's the Knesset that decided, yes, he can be a minister. So after he was confirmed as a minister, the Supreme Court, which again is not elected, overrode what the Knesset said was appropriate and wanted to do. All this law does is take away a power that the Supreme Court arrogated for itself, never should have had, and indeed it does not have in any other country.
Now, that leads me to my next point. How is this likely to impact politics with the overturning of this 1980s law?
Well, the politics in Israel, the protests are going to continue, but the protests were already, it's really interesting. There was a lot of media coverage of 100,000 protesters. There were in Jerusalem against this law. There were 400,000 protesters in Tel Aviv in favor of this new law to rein in this out-of-control Supreme Court. So as far as the politics in Israel is concerned, look, the right wing won a democratic election. This is what happens when you win elections. And when you lose elections, things are not going to go your way. This is something that the left in Israel is finally going to have to come to terms with. It's amazing to watch how this plays out in America, though, because the American left, which is simultaneously claiming that the Supreme Court in the United States is extreme and out of control, is saying to Netanyahu, no, you can't rein in a Supreme Court which actually is extreme and out of control and out of touch with, again, Supreme Courts around the world.
With that, Rabbi Yaakov Menkin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.